Hi, guys, and welcome back into the fourth episode of the Buy Yourself Flowers project. As you remember, I'm Anya.
I'm Ezel. And I'm Sabrina.
Today, we are interviewing Dara Magani, a PhD associate professor and licensed psychologist, about what happens developmentally during adolescence and how parents can help their kids mental health wise through their teenage years. Okay, so let's get right into the questions. Tell me about your background and why did you decide to study psychology and what specifically do you focus on and what motivates you?
Great. Well, thanks for having me today. It's great to know that you all are interested in mental health and wanting to support the knowledge, being kind of transferred to a wider audience. So I am a clinical psychologist, as you mentioned, and I'm licensed to practice in California. I currently am a professor at the University of San Francisco in the clinical psychology PsyD program. I've been interested in talking to people, getting to know what's really getting underneath their skin. And I would say probably around the time that I was your age, maybe even a little younger. I think I was a freshman in high school when I first started thinking that I might be interested in psychology. And I have to credit one of my teachers, very important people in our lives, right? And so my English teacher had suggested doing an assignment that involved some research, and she said, you might be interested in a topic related to perfectionism. And so I wasn't really sure why she indicated that, but I think she had seen little glimmers of that in me and said, you could do a survey, you could ask your friends how they kind of handle stress and schoolwork and all of that kind of thing. And I got super into it. And I found that I really enjoyed the process of research. I loved going to the library and learning what other people had done. And most of all, I loved the content as well as being able to talk to people and get their perspectives on different things. And so that slowly evolved into a desire to be able to help support people when things were not going well. And I knew there were different pathways that I could go down in order to be of help or service to others. But psychology still really was at the heart of my motivation in terms of wanting to be able to sit usually one-on-one, sometimes with smaller groups of people, and supporting them through emotional and kind of transitional times in life that can bring up difficulties. So that's really what has motivated me. And I was initially interested in working with um, children, and I have continued that interest over time, but also within my work now focus on supporting parents during lots of different developmental transitions in their children's lives.
Thank you so much.
I really find that interesting because I think I'm a little bit of a perfectionist as well, like in my life, and I think I find you like really relatable in that sense. I actually want to go into psychology as well. So it's nice to hear that there's other kind of like professional people such as yourself that I can kind of relate to. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think is kind of going on like developmentally in a teenager's brain that can make those kind of these years so kind of confusing and perhaps sometimes difficult?
Absolutely. And I'm very aware of my interviewees right now and where you are in your own developmental stage. So in some ways you might be the best ones to help us answer some of this question. But I would say that research, especially neuroscience research, has found that adolescence is a time of immense change in the brain. Uh, we like to talk about change in the terms not so much as improvements or increases in something, even though there are changes happening that increase, for example, the level of gray matter in your brain. But we also like to talk about brain development being a part of the kind of brain's way of reorganizing itself. So think of it this way. And this happens at kind of a few very kind of milestone transitions in life. We see it happen, for example, in the first 3 years of life when there's an incredible amount of brain development happening. And then it kind of continues steadily until about, age 5 or 6. And then we see another big change happening right around the time that what we call puberty hits. That can be different for children, but we generally think of it as maybe even starting as early as age 8 these days. But really closer to the age of 10, we start to see changes in both the body as well as the brain. And the way I like to talk about it is to say, like, you know how sometimes you have a closet that seems kind of messy and you're like, okay, one day I really need to find this pair of pants and I don't know where it is. So I'm going to take everything out. I'm going to probably end up finding things that I haven't used in a while, and I'm probably going to give them away to Goodwill or give them away to my younger sibling. And then I'm going to find a better organizational system to be able to put those things back in so that I can use my closet more efficiently, right? That is what the brain is doing when it reorganizes itself. So, what's happening, there's like a lot of stimulation coming into the brain, right? And this is why we think of development not just being a biological process, but a social one. It's really, really important to think about the inputs that are coming into one's brain and body system, right? So that's why also when we focus on young children and their development, we talk so much about the importance of interacting with babies, giving them a lot of feedback, why we naturally, this is an evolutionary thing, why we naturally have certain ways of our facial expressions and voices changing when we're talking to babies, because we know that input is going in and it's actually changing their brain structure, changing who they are and what they think about themselves. So the same thing is happening at adolescence as well. It's a social and biological and neurological process where lots of things are being brought into the system, kind of reorganized. Networks are increasing in density, and making the brain ideally more efficient and ready to move on to later stages of life. So that's in a nutshell, kind of some of the things that we see happening in the brain.
Thank you so much. Like further along that line of parent interactions with children, I just had a question. What are some normal emotional changes that teenagers might experience during this time as they're going through all of this stuff biologically that parents might interpret as potential like bad behavior?
Yeah, great question. I think that behavior is usually an expression of what's going on underneath, right? Sometimes it's hard as parents, and I myself am one of a 5 and 10-year-old, so I have some understanding of the personal kind of level of experience with that. But usually we think of behavior, and as a parent, you're really primed to say, we've got to do something to make sure that behavior is appropriate for society, right? Oftentimes, our mental model of parenting is about how do I make sure that my child is able to move through all of their developmental, milestones and succeed, right? And so when we see things like bad behavior, usually we're thinking of not listening to parents, not wanting to do certain things that we believe are good for children, um, telling them not to do something because we know maybe from our own experiences that it's not a really productive or useful thing for their own social or emotional development. But usually, what's going on underneath the surface, and I think you all might be able to relate to some degree, is a desire for independence and moving into themselves, so to speak. One of the major theorists that started talking about identity development and different changes in life stages is Erik Erikson. He's well known in the developmental psychology field. And he talks about adolescence really being a stage of uh, individuals figuring out their identities and sometimes, making some errors along the way while they try different things on, right? Think of it kind of going back to the closet example. It's like trying on different clothes, and what might have fit you or looked good on you, or you felt looked good on you 2 years ago, you might be like, I can't believe I wore that, you know? And so emotions are underlying the behavior and what we might term as bad behaviors, but they're usually a signal that there's a lot happening that an adolescent is trying to figure out. And oftentimes the bridge is not fully built. And when I talk about the bridge, it's the bridge of communication, right? It's the bridge of being able to communicate from child to parent and parent to child, that here's how I'm feeling about this. I'm not quite sure how to tell you because it's all new for me. And yet parents are still kind of generally operating in the way that they might have when they were raising, toddlers, young children, and feeling like they needed to really be the ones to tell their adolescent what to do. So you start to see a little bit of a clash, and sometimes that gets interpreted as bad behavior or defiance when we actually think that it's more so the emergence of independence, or what sometimes we term autonomy, wanting to kind of be able to do certain things on your own, um, and maybe not having space for that always.
Your research on early childhood mental health highlights how early relationships with parents often shape later development. And how would you say that these relationships carry into adolescence, and what shifts in the relationships should parents expect, as the kids move up to adolescence?
Absolutely. Um, I hope it's okay if I ask you all a little bit to reflect on, your own thoughts about how things were with your parents when you were, for example, 7 years old, and maybe how they are now, right? Um, I welcome you to just maybe say a few words, or like maybe a couple of literally words that come to mind when you think of your relationship with your parent when you were 7 years old.
Well, I think there was a lot more dependence when I was 7 years old. I would often, a lot of the things that they would say, I would use that as a model for my actions and what I would kind of believe. But I think maybe as I've grown up a bit, I've gained more independence and had the capability to kind of come out of my shell and express myself in my own way. That's a different version of my parents, still while maintaining a close relationship.
Hmm.
I think that's a good
Absolutely.
point. I think the coming out of your shell and like developing your own like opinions and like a nuance of kind of your parents' kind of teachings comes with like experience and thus like age. So maybe so that kind of for me explains the fact that we kind of come up with our own opinions because at times I feel like my opinions can be quite different to my parents and that can sometimes kind of we can like kind of clash and it's quite different to when I was 7 years old. But I think that's kind of essential. And I think when you're talking about communication earlier, I think that's when that really comes into play. And that's, maintaining that communication as, parents change and the child changes. I think that's like really important.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I fully agree with what both of them said. I think like when I was younger, there was definitely like parents had most control over my life, obviously, because like as Zora and Sabina said, like I was more dependent on them. And it was just natural. And as I've gotten older, obviously I've craved more independence as I've been able to do more things on my own. But it isn't always smooth sailing. I think there's definitely times where my parents want more control than I want to give them, and there's sort of that tension there. But I think like it's everyone's first time living, and there's obviously going to be like these sort of things that come up, and I think that's definitely one of the big things that affects like adolescence and teenage years.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your own experiences. I mean, that's oftentimes one way to kind of understand things when you're able to step back and reflect, right? I will say that I really think about there's many, many things that shape later development, but I will think about them in terms of the relationship. And when I consider what we know really shapes early experiences and relationships between babies and parents, uh, I think of like kind of two major concepts that researchers have talked about. One is the development of trust, and trust in the sense of being able to trust relationships, but before it within relationships, but also being able to trust yourself and your own body and all the things that you're thinking about, right? Trusting our own instincts, trusting that our bodies will kind of behave in predictable ways. Those are major tasks of early life. For example, with a baby, right? And that's really the focus of my research. So I'll go into a little bit here. But when an infant is born, there's so much going on related to figuring out how they are going to regulate themselves, right? And of course, they're not maybe thinking of it in the same way that we're talking about it in like such an agentic or conscious way. But a baby signals when their needs are not being met. They're signaling through things like crying, fussing, maybe not sleeping at night. There's various needs that we have learned over time that a baby requires support with, and we call that co-regulation. And over time, they're able to learn that with the help of an experienced, supportive, and trustworthy adult, they are able to learn how to regulate themselves, right? So ultimately, our goal, at least in many industrialized societies, is to move a child towards independence. And that's true even for babies, right? We ultimately, I remember being a parent and thinking, when will my baby fall asleep on their own and I don't have to be in this room with them for 3 hours at night, right? And of course, now I miss that. But I will say that we learn how to trust ourselves, our bodies in the earliest stages of life, and that's oftentimes supported by our caregivers. And so trust is really important because it starts to give us a model of what we can expect from other relationships in the future, right? And so when we learn, and it doesn't have to be limited to your parents, it could be other caregivers, other people in your life, eventually siblings potentially, or even peer relationships, right? It all starts to transfer, especially in adolescence when your social world becomes so much more salient and sometimes more important than maybe your immediate personal familial network, right? So trust is one of those pieces around the parental-child relationship that is really important to think about supporting and building in those early stages. That doesn't mean that if it's not established then that it can't be later, but it is one thing that babies and toddlers use as a little bit of a guide to the rest of the relationships they build in their lives. For example, when they go to daycare and preschool and kindergarten and elementary school, can I trust my teachers? Can I trust my friends? Can I trust the parents of my friends, right? Learning who in their lives are going to contribute to healthy development. The second major kind of concept that I like to think about in terms of what shapes later development is actually along the lines of what you brought up, Anya, the idea that we call as researchers mismatch and repair. This is something that happens all the time in relationships. We don't always get it right. Parents definitely don't always get it right. And I'm not just talking about major decisions, but I'm talking about even little conversations that we're having, right? We know that when we can have trust in a relationship, there can be mismatches or what might be sometimes termed as, micro arguments, disagreements, times when you're like, you just don't get me. And the parent's like, yeah, you're right. I actually don't get you. That stuff is happening early in life as well, right? The parent is trying to figure out before a child can even speak, what do you need? You're crying so much. Are you hungry? Are you sleepy? Do you need some cuddling? Do you need a change of scenery? Trying lots of different things until the baby kind of regulates and calms down. And we know that just because you have a disagreement or a moment of kind of missed connection, that doesn't mean that your relationship is not strong. In fact, it's really the repair that is very meaningful after this episode, right? What happens after a mismatch occurs? And there's a lot of actually observational psychological studies that have happened with young babies and mothers, usually mothers, now fathers too, trying to understand how often is there mismatch in a strongly bonded dyad, a mother-child relationship. It actually happens like 35 to 40% of the time in their interactions. We don't get it right kind of a third or close to a quarter of the time. And so I think learning over time that you can have misconnections, mismatches, and move forward. That doesn't mean that the relationship is not good, but it means that you're continuing to try to figure things out. And that is really, again, also going back to the piece of communication, which both of you brought up as well. It's moving in a direction for adolescents, for parents to think about how can we adjust our communication to be more age appropriate and also align with where the my child is starting to move to, right? So trust, mismatch, and repair are not the only, but I would say foundational concepts that are related to early life experiences and the development of the earliest relationships that often translate into adolescence, and help parents to kind of navigate this new time. So I'll kind of pause there.
I just want to ask another question, like to do with this kind of trust. How do you continue to kind of build and nurture that kind of sense of trust when you can face like adversity like within the relationship, and also if neither party knows how to communicate the best? Because obviously, as Anya said, like it's not always smooth sailing, and we're all like living life for the first time, of course. So if neither party kind of knows how to conduct the repair, how do you suggest going about nurturing that sense of trust, even if you both know that the relationship is strong? How do
Mhm.
you go about,
Communicating.
yeah.
Yeah, this is the complication, absolutely. And why oftentimes that parent-child relationship feels strained, and sometimes, it feels like it's a chronic issue. Like I just can't get through to my teenager. And then the teenager is like, my mom just doesn't understand me, and that kind of continues and just turns into a little bit of a narrative for some period of time, right? I get it. I've been there too. And so I think this is where really the task is for parents, right? We think of it, again in the phrasing of younger children. Oftentimes in my work with young children and parents, when parents come in for, supporting their child's behavioral or emotional challenges, we work together with children and parents in therapy. And I'm not moving in that direction just yet for adolescents who are having communication challenges. But what I'll say is that oftentimes we remind the parent that they are the bigger, stronger, wiser person. That doesn't mean that they should always have more power, or that they shouldn't afford some level of status and respect to their teenager, right? We kind of have to enforce those three terms for parents of younger children, because sometimes they can be overly permissive and let their toddlers walk all over them. And that actually doesn't instill a sense of trust and safety for children either. They really need structure, particularly in those early years. But similarly speaking, I would say in adolescence, when communication gaps are happening, we want to help support parents to be able to first be aware that, okay, this is a new thing for me too. My child is shifting, changing, behaving differently than I remember her being just even 6 months ago. And that means I also need to step back and reassess what my strategies have been in my own communication with my child, right? So usually when things get challenging, the first step is like becoming aware of what is going on and being able to take a step back. Um, the other piece is being able to focus on the things that you do have that are strong in your relationship, um, and knowing that not everything needs to be fixed in the immediate moment, right? And so, like, what can be very difficult to do, and I think I say this even as a parent myself, is actually not to lecture my child or to tell them all these things when emotions are really high, because none of it's going in. The communication is just not going to happen when either party is really amped up, right? So a lot of the secret to communication is actually stopping the communication for a little while and maybe retreating and saying, let's all cool off. Let's take some deep breaths. You do what you need to do. If you need, my daughter, for example, likes to go and listen to her music, with her headphones. And it's like, cool, when you're ready, we'll have a conversation. So I think part of it is recalibrating the ways in which you communicate, as well as how you can foster, uh, healthy periods of silence. I think sometimes we forget as parents that kids just want us there. They don't like need us to be talking at them all the time or telling them what's wrong, but kind of just want us to be on the sidelines, maybe even just again as that comforting presence. And so there's a lot that can be communicated without language. So that kind of like goes a bit around your question, but I would like to kind of maybe close that one out by saying, a lot of the challenges with communication can be overcome by first recognizing there are challenges and being honest about it, and then maybe making some conscious decisions with your child, to say, hey, we didn't really have a great way of talking about you wanting to go to this party on Saturday. Can we try that again? So a lot of researchers and clinicians are lately encouraging parents to ask, not tell, when they're trying to communicate with their child. Um, and again, still hold a level of structure and discipline to it, right? Parents are still very much responsible for their child's safety and well-being. And sometimes we know that adolescents want to make decisions that might not be the best for them because they just don't have the foresight. But at the same time, having a conversation that feels more collaborative can be really supportive in improving the connection and communication between a parent and child.
Yeah, thank you for that.
You've spoken a bit about how family stress arose during COVID-19, and I was wondering, what warning signs did you notice among teens, especially specifically about the digital world during COVID-19 that parents now should look out for nowadays, and how can parents step in early to support mental well-being?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big topic. And you know, I I'll say that there was a lot of stress during COVID-19, a lot of concern about what was going to happen developmentally for particularly this age group that was all of a sudden limited in what they could do in interactionally with their friends, and then started turning largely to social media as a way, right? So to connect. And so we know that that's what we had to rely on for several months to years for many people. And on the one hand, having social media and technology was really beneficial to be able to help support resilience and kind of social development of adolescents at that time. And on the other hand, it may have also increased feelings of isolation and decreased self-esteem. And so when we think of the psychological or emotional constructs that we might want to be thoughtful about even now, those are the two that really come to my mind in terms of what parents want to be on the lookout for is how did the overuse and overdependence on technology and social media um, kind of impact their children's lives and their own feelings about themselves. That's how we think about self-esteem, as well as, was there then a tendency to want to connect more with people through these more technological channels than necessarily being with people in person? Um, I know that it feels sometimes like you're with somebody in person when you're online, and that's a great way to have something, over nothing. And it may have turned into a default for a lot of children who might have maybe already been a little bit shy or reserved and have felt like I'd rather have this little barrier between me and another person. Um, Social media, of course, encapsulates many, many different types of kind of platforms, right? There's interactional platforms. There's ones where it's very one-sided and you're just like watching reel after reel or whatever. Um, so I think that parents really need to be more aware of what kind of content their adolescent is consuming through social media and how it could be potentially contributing to worsening sense of isolation, which can happen if it's like, oh, all these people are doing all these things and I'm over here. A little bit of that kind of FOMO feeling that can come up sometimes, or the um, jumping to conclusions about what other people's lives are like based on a snippet that you see in social media, right? We all do this. It's not just adolescents, but adolescents, because of where they are socially, emotionally, and biologically, they're more likely to think of those moments that they see, for example, where, oh, my friends are all out, they're having a great time, or
Thank you so much.
I just have a kind of follow-up question from that. You're saying that it's important in a sense to kind of not restrict, but I guess kind of control what's being consumed like on social media, on the phone. How should the two parties communicate about setting those kind of restrictions to make sure that, the child isn't offended, that the parent's trying to control their life, and also that the parent isn't thinking that the child's walking all over them?
Mhm. It's complicated. There's no silver bullet here. I wish I could say that there was, here's one strategy to follow and it's going to be successful 100% of the time. I think again, it goes back to parents thinking of themselves and shifting into what a couple of researchers have recently termed kind of the mentor model rather than being an enforcer or protector, right? So it's important for parents to consider what role do they want to play in this process? Do they want to enforce? And do they want to say, I told you you weren't supposed to use your phone after 8 p.m. and here you are, I'm taking it away and you're not going to use it for a week. That doesn't feel very collaborative for sure. And I'm sure it's not going to improve the connection or communication between the parent and child. Does the parent want to be the protector, or do they see themselves as a protector, which kind of, as you mentioned just now, like, I don't want you going to these websites. I don't want you to go to these channels because they're going to show you things you really shouldn't be looking at. And God forbid you see that stuff. And right. And so kind of being very intrusive and restricting by maybe even saying, you don't get your own device, or I'm going to control all the things that you look at. There is a more of a kind of in-between model where a parent might provide what we call high standards and high support. So I expect with this device that you use it responsibly. Is that something we can agree on? Let's talk about what that looks like. A lot of schools, and maybe yours as well, have started to develop these contracts or device use kind of agreements. And it sounds a little bit maybe corny or too structured for us to suggest that parents might do something like that at home. But that's oftentimes been really supportive in the communication around figuring out what the boundaries are and how to help the adolescent kind of maintain those boundaries without too much enforcement from the parent. The other piece I'll point out is that, at least when it comes to screen time, there's a lot of information that's coming out about predictors of adolescent screen time, right? What do you think one of the biggest predictors of teenage screen time is?
Stress.
Could be stress. Any other ideas?
Do you guys have any ideas?
The question, what was the question?
I'll say it again. What do you think one of the biggest predictors of a teenager's screen time is?
Maybe,
Isolation, I
yeah, I
would
was gonna
say.
say like their level of connection with the outside world. Like typically, like if you see your friend's screen time and it's 10 hours, you're gonna kind of assume that they are rotting in bed, or they're not really connecting with other people. Like I don't know, it could be a factor.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that those are definitely factors that contribute to increases in screen time as well as the maintenance of high screen time. Something that we're finding out, which is not surprising, is that it's actually parental screen time that influences teenagers' screen time. So when you see your parents on their devices all the time, because it also, many of us do it for work, we're on our phones, we're saying, oh, hold on, honey, I got to answer this email really quick, or I got to text this parent about who's bringing snack to soccer practice. We are all tied to our screens. And so, one of you brought up earlier about your relationship with your parent at age 7 and how much modeling was happening and how you were thinking about, the types of things that they did and how you would kind of become eventually a version of that, even if you weren't doing that consciously. Um, the same thing is happening when children are watching their parents on the screen, and sometimes there's no way around it. But I think that one of the pieces that we need to know about is, you know, help parents navigate how much they use their screen when their children are around.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for your,
so
Thank you. This was
much.
lovely.
yeah, like this was really, really insightful. I learned so much.